The most painful silence is not the one where nobody speaks. It is the silence where someone has been taught that their voice does not matter. Ethan Carter learned that lesson before he was old enough to understand why. Growing up as an Omega in the Carter family meant following rules that had existed for generations. Be respectful. Do not challenge others. Do not draw attention. A good Omega was expected to be calm, agreeable, and quiet. Ethan followed those expectations so well that people often forgot he was there. At family gatherings, conversations moved around him. At important events, others spoke for him. When decisions were made about his future, nobody asked what he wanted. They simply assumed they already knew. The world saw his silence as obedience, but nobody saw the thoughts, ideas, and dreams hidden behind it. The day of the selection ceremony arrived with excitement throughout the city of Westbridge. The Grand Selection Center was filled with families, alphas, and omegas waiting for the moment that could change their lives forever. Elegant lights covered the massive hall, and hundreds of guests gathered to witness the choices that would shape future alliances. Ethan stood among the other omegas, wearing a simple but refined outfit chosen by his family. He looked calm on the outside, but inside, he carried the same familiar feeling. He was present, but invisible. Around him, other omegas introduced themselves confidently. They shared their achievements, their family histories, and their hopes for the future. Ethan listened quietly, not because he had nothing to say, but because years of being ignored had taught him that speaking rarely changed anything. His family stood nearby, proudly discussing his older cousin's accomplishments and the reputation of their bloodline. Nobody asked Ethan about his own goals. Nobody asked what he wanted from the future. Then the selection ceremony began. One by one, alphas made their choices. The room filled with applause and celebration as names were announced. Ethan watched from the side, already preparing himself for the moment when everyone else would move forward without him. He had become skilled at accepting disappointment before it arrived. Then the doors of the selection hall opened. The entire room became quiet. Nathaniel Brooks entered. The apex alpha who had built a reputation for being selective, composed, and impossible to impress. Everyone knew his presence changed the atmosphere. Families immediately turned their attention toward him. Whispers spread across the room as people guessed which Omega would capture his interest. Many believed the choice was obvious. They expected Nathaniel to choose someone admired by everyone. Someone whose confidence filled the room. Someone who matched the image people had created in their minds. Ethan lowered his eyes, certain that the moment would pass like every other moment in his life. But then something unexpected happened. Nathaniel did not look toward the loudest person in the room. He did not follow the expectations everyone had prepared for him. Instead, his eyes moved across the hall and stopped on Ethan. For a moment, Ethan wondered if he was mistaken. Nobody looked at him during moments like this. Nobody searched for him in a crowd. But Nathaniel continued walking forward. The room watched in disbelief as the most respected alpha in Westbridge approached the person everyone had overlooked. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken, not because he expected to be chosen, but because for the first time in his life, someone seemed determined to hear the voice he had been forced to hide. The entire selection hall fell silent as Nathaniel Brooks stopped in front of Ethan Carter. For a moment, Ethan forgot how to react. His entire life had prepared him for being overlooked, not for being noticed. The powerful apex alpha standing before him was the last person he expected to see. "I believe my choice is clear," Nathaniel said calmly. His voice carried through the hall, leaving no doubt about his decision. The reaction was immediate. Conversations spread across the room as people tried to understand what had just happened. Families looked surprised. Several guests exchanged confused expressions. Everyone had expected Nathaniel to choose an Omega who represented confidence, influence, and a well-known family name. Nobody expected him to choose Ethan. Ethan lowered his gaze, feeling the familiar instinct to step back and avoid attention. "There must be some misunderstanding," Ethan said quietly. Nathaniel looked at him with a calm expression. "Why do you believe that?" Ethan hesitated. The answer seemed obvious to him. "Because there are others here who make more sense." Nathaniel studied him carefully. More sense according to who? Ethan did not know how to respond. He had spent years accepting other people's opinions before forming his own. Nathaniel's question felt unfamiliar because nobody had ever asked him to consider his own answer. After the ceremony, Ethan was taken to a private meeting room where selected omegas and alphas usually discussed the next steps. He expected Nathaniel to arrive with confidence and explain a decision based on duty or responsibility. Instead, when Nathaniel entered, he simply sat across from him and allowed the silence to exist. Ethan noticed something unusual. Nathaniel was not uncomfortable with silence. He was not rushing to fill the space. He was actually listening. "You seem surprised," Nathaniel said. Ethan gave a small, honest smile. "I am trying to understand why you chose me." Nathaniel looked at him. "Because everyone else was trying to show me what they wanted me to see." Ethan listened carefully. "And you? You were not trying to impress anyone." Ethan looked away. "That is because I learned it was better not to speak." The words were quiet, but Nathaniel noticed their meaning. "Who taught you that?" Ethan paused. It was a simple question, but it carried more weight than he expected. He thought about his childhood, the reminders from family members, the expectations placed on him, the moments when staying quiet seemed easier than explaining himself. "Everyone," Ethan finally answered. Nathaniel's expression changed slightly, not with pity, but with understanding. "Then they were wrong." Ethan looked at him. "You do not even know me." Nathaniel replied. "I know enough to understand that someone who spends years making room for others is not someone without value." For the first time, Ethan did not know what to say. He had spent so long believing his silence was proof that he had nothing important to offer. Nathaniel saw something completely different. He saw patience. He saw kindness. He saw someone who had strength without needing attention. Outside the meeting room, rumors about Nathaniel's decision continued spreading throughout Westbridge. People questioned his choice and wondered what he saw in Ethan that everyone else had missed. But inside the room, Ethan experienced something he had never felt before. He was not being interrupted. He was not being compared. He was not being told what he should become. Someone was simply asking who he really was. And for Ethan, that question was more powerful than any selection announcement. Because for the first time, he began to wonder if his voice had always mattered, even when nobody else was willing to listen. After the selection ceremony, Ethan Carter returned to his family home with a feeling he could not describe. Everything around him looked the same, but his life no longer felt the same. The quiet rooms, the familiar hallways, and the traditions his family followed for years suddenly seemed different. Before, Ethan had always believed he was meant to stay in the background. Now, for the first time, someone had looked directly at him and asked who he truly was. The attention should have felt exciting, but instead, it made him nervous. Ethan was not used to being the person everyone wanted answers from. When he entered the family dining room, he immediately noticed the change in atmosphere. His relatives were discussing Nathaniel Brooks and the unexpected choice that had shocked the entire city. Everyone had questions. Why would an apex alpha choose Ethan? What did Nathaniel see that nobody else saw? Ethan sat quietly, listening to the conversations around him. The old instinct to disappear returned immediately. He wanted to lower his head and let others speak for him. But then he remembered Nathaniel's question. "Who taught you that your voice did not matter?" The thought stayed with him. For years, Ethan had accepted silence as part of his identity. He had never considered that silence was something placed on him by others. Later that evening, Ethan received an invitation from the Brooks family estate. Nathaniel wanted to speak with him privately about the future. When Ethan arrived, he expected another formal conversation filled with expectations. Instead, Nathaniel welcomed him into a peaceful garden overlooking the city. The atmosphere was calm, far away from the pressure of the selection hall. "You look like you are preparing for a difficult conversation," Nathaniel said. Ethan smiled slightly. "Maybe I am." "Why?" Nathaniel asked. Ethan looked toward the city lights. "Because I do not know what people expect from me now." Nathaniel remained quiet, giving Ethan space to continue. "Before today, nobody cared what I thought," Ethan admitted. "Now everyone wants to know why you chose me." Nathaniel nodded. "And what do you think the answer is?" Ethan thought for a moment. "Maybe you made a mistake." Nathaniel looked surprised. "You still believe that?" Ethan did not answer immediately. The truth was that part of him still did. Old beliefs were difficult to leave behind. Nathaniel walked slowly through the garden, then said, "Ethan, being quiet does not mean you have nothing to say. It means people have not taken the time to listen." Those words touched something deep inside Ethan. Nobody had ever described him that way before. His silence had always been treated as a weakness. Nathaniel saw it as something created by circumstances, not something that defined him. "I do not want you to become someone else," Nathaniel continued. I want you to understand who you already are. Ethan looked at him carefully. For years, he had tried to become easier for others to accept. He had hidden opinions, emotions, and dreams because he thought they were inconvenient. But standing there with Nathaniel, he started to wonder what his life would look like if he stopped apologizing for existing. The next day, news about Nathaniel's choice continued spreading throughout Westbridge. Some people supported the decision. Others questioned it. The Carter family received messages from influential families asking for explanations. Ethan knew the attention would not disappear quickly, but something inside him had changed. He was still nervous. He was still learning. Yet for the first time, he wanted to discover the person behind all the silence. And maybe, just maybe, his voice had been waiting all along for the right moment to be heard. The attention surrounding Ethan Carter continued to grow, but the more people talked about him, the more he realized how little they truly knew. Most conversations focused on one question. Why would Nathaniel Brooks choose an Omega who had spent his entire life staying quiet? The answer seemed impossible for many people to understand because they had only ever seen Ethan from the outside. They saw a reserved Omega who avoided attention. They saw someone who rarely spoke during important gatherings. They saw someone who allowed others to make decisions for him. They never saw the person behind that silence. A few days after the selection ceremony, Ethan was invited to a family meeting at the Carter residence. He already knew the purpose before entering the room. His family wanted answers. Several relatives sat around the table, discussing the situation with serious expressions. They were not angry, but they were concerned about how the choice affected the family's reputation. Ethan sat quietly at first, listening as everyone discussed his future without asking what he wanted. It was a familiar feeling. For years, this had been normal. But this time, something inside him felt different. When one family member suggested that Nathaniel might eventually reconsider his choice, Ethan looked up. The room became quiet because everyone noticed the change. "I do not think he made a mistake," Ethan said. The words were simple, but they surprised everyone, including himself. His family looked at him as if they were hearing his voice for the first time. Ethan continued, "Nathaniel made his decision because he understood something about me that nobody else tried to understand." The room remained silent. For the first time, Ethan was not waiting for permission to speak. He was simply expressing what he believed. Later that day, Ethan met Nathaniel at the Brooks estate. The large property was elegant but peaceful, surrounded by gardens and open spaces. Nathaniel noticed that Ethan seemed different. Not completely confident yet, but stronger. "Something changed," Nathaniel said. Ethan smiled slightly. "I think I finally realized that silence and weakness are not the same thing." Nathaniel nodded. "That is something you should have known from the beginning." Ethan looked toward the garden. "I spent so much time thinking I was invisible because I was not important." Nathaniel answered, "Sometimes people ignore what they do not understand." Their conversation was interrupted by a message from the selection council. The council requested a formal review meeting regarding Nathaniel's choice. The announcement created even more discussion throughout Westbridge. Some believed Nathaniel had challenged traditions that should remain unchanged. Others wondered if the selection process had been judging people unfairly for years. Ethan read the message carefully. A few weeks earlier, the idea of standing before the council would have terrified him. He would have searched for a way to avoid attention. But now, he felt something different. He was still nervous, but he was no longer willing to disappear. "Are you afraid?" Nathaniel asked. Ethan thought about the question. "Yes," he answered honestly. Nathaniel smiled. "Good." Ethan looked surprised. "Good. It means this matters to you." Those words stayed with Ethan. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was choosing to move forward despite it. The day of the council meeting arrived, and Ethan entered the building beside Nathaniel. The same kind of people who once overlooked him were now waiting to hear what he had to say. But before the meeting began, Ethan discovered something unexpected in the council records. There were documents connected to his family history that had never been shown to him. Something about his past had been hidden for years. And for the first time, Ethan wondered if his silence had not only been taught to him, but carefully maintained by those who benefited from it. The hidden records inside the Selection Council archives revealed a truth that Ethan Carter had never expected. For years, he believed his silence was simply part of who he was. He thought he was naturally quiet, naturally less important, naturally someone who belonged behind others. But as Ethan and Nathaniel Brooks reviewed the documents together, he discovered that his entire understanding of himself had been shaped by decisions made long before he was old enough to question them. The records showed that Ethan's family had intentionally limited information about him within the selection system, not because Ethan lacked value, but because they believed controlling his image would protect the family's reputation and future opportunities. They had decided that being quiet would make life easier for him. They never realized that taking away his choices would also take away his confidence. Ethan stared at the documents in silence. The discovery did not make him angry. Instead, it left him thinking about all the years he spent blaming himself. "So I was not born this way," Ethan said softly. Nathaniel looked at him. "What do you mean?" Ethan touched the old records carefully. "I always thought there was something wrong with me. I thought I was naturally someone who could not speak up." Nathaniel shook his head. "You were taught to doubt yourself. That is different." Those words changed something inside Ethan. He had spent years trying to fix a problem that was never truly his. The problem was never that he had nothing to say. The problem was that nobody gave him a reason to believe his words mattered. As they continued reading the records, they discovered more information about Ethan's background. His family history showed a pattern of intelligence, creativity, and leadership among previous generations. Ethan had inherited those qualities, but they were never encouraged because his family believed a quiet Omega would create fewer difficulties. The truth was painful, but it was also freeing. Ethan finally understood why Nathaniel had noticed him. Nathaniel had not discovered something hidden that made Ethan valuable. Nathaniel had simply recognized the value that was already there. Later that evening, Ethan walked through the gardens of the Brooks estate with Nathaniel. The city lights of Westbridge shined in the distance, and for once, Ethan did not feel like he was watching the world from outside. "I used to think being invisible protected me," Ethan admitted. Nathaniel listened carefully. "And now?" Ethan looked ahead. "Now I think it only stopped me from knowing myself." Nathaniel smiled. "That is a difficult thing to realize." Ethan nodded. "But I think it is necessary." Their conversation was interrupted by another message from the council. The upcoming review meeting would no longer be only about Nathaniel's choice. It would also examine how the selection system treated people who did not fit traditional expectations. Ethan understood the importance of that moment. His story had started as one person being overlooked. Now it represented a larger question about fairness and understanding. The night before the meeting, Ethan stood in front of the mirror and practiced what he wanted to say. Years ago, he would have been embarrassed to hear his own voice. Now he was learning to trust it. The next morning, Ethan entered the council hall beside Nathaniel. The same place where he once stood silently among the crowd now felt different. He was still nervous. He was still afraid of judgment. But he was no longer hiding. For the first time, Ethan walked into the room not as someone waiting to be accepted, but as someone ready to be heard. The council hall of Westbridge had never felt so quiet. Ethan Carter stood at the center of the room, surrounded by people who had spent years making decisions about others without truly knowing them. The same place where he once stood unnoticed was now the place where everyone waited for his words. Nathaniel Brooks stood beside him, but Ethan understood something important. This was not Nathaniel's moment. It was his. The council began the review meeting by presenting the concerns surrounding the selection system. Several members explained that traditions had existed for generations and that changing them would require careful consideration. They spoke about stability, reputation, and expectations. Ethan listened patiently, remembering how he used to accept every opinion around him without questioning it. But now, he understood that tradition alone could not decide what was right. One council member looked toward Ethan. "Your experience has become the center of this discussion. Do you understand the responsibility that comes with speaking today?" Ethan took a slow breath. Years ago, that question would have frightened him. He would have searched for the safest answer. He would have tried to avoid causing discomfort. But he was no longer the person who believed his voice was a problem. "Yes," Ethan answered. "And I also understand that staying silent does not solve anything." The room became still. Ethan continued, "For a long time, I believed silence was the only way I could belong. I thought being easy to ignore meant I was doing everything correctly. But I learned that a person should not have to disappear to make others comfortable." Nathaniel watched quietly, knowing Ethan had reached the moment he had been preparing for. Ethan was no longer speaking because someone gave him permission. He was speaking because he finally believed his thoughts had value. The council reviewed more records and discovered that Ethan's situation was not unique. Many Omegas throughout history had been encouraged to remain quiet because society believed it created order. But the result was that many talented and thoughtful individuals never had the chance to show who they truly were. Ethan looked at the documents and felt a deep connection to those stories. He knew what it felt like to believe nobody wanted to hear him. After the meeting, Ethan and Nathaniel walked through the halls of the council building. The long corridors were filled with portraits of past leaders and important figures from selection history. "Are you disappointed?" Nathaniel asked. Ethan looked confused. "Why would I be?" Nathaniel smiled slightly. "Because the process is complicated. Change will not happen immediately." Ethan thought about that for a moment. "I think I finally understand something. I used to want everyone to see me right away, but now I know real change takes time." Nathaniel nodded. "That is a very different answer from the person I met at the ceremony." Ethan smiled. "I am still that person." Nathaniel looked at him. "Yes, you just finally stopped hiding." Later that evening, the council announced that a new evaluation process would be created. It would focus on individual character, personal choices, and true compatibility rather than outdated expectations. The announcement spread throughout Westbridge, creating conversations everywhere. Some people welcomed the changes. Others questioned them. But for the first time, Ethan was not afraid of the discussion. He knew his story had started with silence, but it would not end there. Standing beside Nathaniel under the city lights, Ethan realized something that changed everything. His voice was never missing. It had always been there. He just needed to believe it deserved to be heard. The announcement of the new selection evaluation process changed the atmosphere throughout Westbridge, but Ethan Carter knew that changing a system built over generations would not happen overnight. For many people, the old traditions represented safety and order. For others, especially those who had been overlooked, the changes represented a chance to finally be understood. Ethan watched the discussions from a different perspective now. He was no longer the person standing quietly in the background, hoping nobody noticed him. He was someone whose experience had become a reason for people to ask important questions. A few weeks after the council meeting, Ethan and Nathaniel Brooks visited the selection archives again. The purpose was to review more historical records and understand how many people had been affected by the old expectations. As they walked through the archive rooms, Ethan noticed hundreds of files containing stories from previous generations. Each record represented a person with hopes, fears, and dreams. Each person had a voice, even if nobody had taken the time to listen. "There are so many stories here," Ethan said quietly. Nathaniel looked at the shelves around them. Most people only remember the choices that were made. They rarely think about the people who were never given a chance. Ethan understood those words deeply. He remembered how it felt to stand in the selection hall and believe that his place was simply to wait. Now he wondered how many others had experienced the same feeling. The investigation continued, and the council discovered more examples of individuals who had been judged too quickly. Their personalities, abilities, and hopes had often been ignored because they did not match traditional expectations. Ethan realized that his experience was part of a much larger pattern. That discovery gave him a new sense of purpose. He no longer wanted to speak only for himself. He wanted others to have the opportunity he once wished for. Later that week, Ethan attended a public discussion about the future of selection. The event was filled with families, alphas, and omegas who wanted to understand the changes. Some people supported the reforms immediately. Others remained uncertain. When Ethan stepped forward, he felt the familiar nervousness return. Speaking in front of a crowd had once seemed impossible. But this time, he remembered the person he used to be and the person he was becoming. "I spent many years believing my silence was part of who I was," Ethan said. "But I learned that silence can also come from being told your thoughts do not matter." The audience listened carefully. Ethan continued, "Everyone has a story. Everyone has something valuable to share. We should never decide someone's worth before we understand them." From the side of the room, Nathaniel watched with quiet pride. He remembered the first day he saw Ethan in the selection hall. Back then, Ethan believed he had nothing important to offer. Now he was standing in front of hundreds of people, sharing a message that could change how they viewed others. After the event, Ethan and Nathaniel walked through Westbridge together. The city felt different, not because everything had changed, but because Ethan had changed the way he saw himself. "Do you realize how far you have come?" Nathaniel asked. Ethan smiled. Sometimes I still remember the person who stood in that hall and thought nobody would ever hear him. Nathaniel looked at him. And what would you tell that person now? Ethan thought for a moment. Then he answered, I would tell him to be patient. His voice was always there. As they continued walking, Ethan received a message from the council about one final discovery in the archives. A forgotten record had been found, connected to the origins of the selection traditions. Ethan looked at Nathaniel, knowing that their journey was not finished yet. But this time, he was not afraid of what they would find. He had learned something more powerful than any title or position. The truth could be hidden for years, but a voice that finally found confidence could never be ignored again. The final discovery inside the selection archives revealed a truth that connected everything Ethan Carter had experienced. The forgotten records were not only about his family. They showed the history of a system that had slowly created expectations about who deserved to be heard and who was expected to remain quiet. Ethan stood in the archive room with Nathaniel Brooks beside him, reading the documents that had been hidden for years. The information was difficult to process, not because it changed who Ethan was, but because it explained why so many people like him had struggled to find their place. The records showed that the original purpose of selection had never been about status or reputation. Long ago, it was created to understand people as individuals. But over time, traditions changed. People began focusing on appearances, family influence, and social expectations. The system that was meant to connect people slowly became a system that judged them. Ethan looked at the old documents and thought about the younger version of himself. The Omega who believed his silence was a weakness. The person who thought speaking up would only create problems. Now he understood that his quiet nature had never been the issue. The issue was a world that decided some voices mattered more than others. This is bigger than my story, Ethan said. Nathaniel looked at him. Yes, and that is why your story matters. The next council meeting became one of the most important discussions in Westbridge history. Ethan entered the hall with Nathaniel, but this time he did not feel like someone who needed protection. He felt like someone carrying a message. The council presented the historical findings, and the room listened carefully. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he stood before everyone without hesitation. For a long time, I believed I was quiet because that was who I was, Ethan said. But I learned that sometimes people become silent because they are never given the chance to speak. The room remained still. Ethan continued. A person should not have to prove their value before they are treated with respect. They should be understood first. His words were not angry. They were honest. And that honesty made them powerful. Nathaniel watched from nearby, remembering the first time he saw Ethan at the selection ceremony. Everyone else saw someone who disappeared into the background. Nathaniel saw someone who had learned to survive in a world that never asked what he wanted. After the meeting, many people approached Ethan to share their own experiences. Some admitted they had also felt overlooked. Others said they never realized how much their assumptions affected others. Ethan listened carefully, understanding that being heard also meant learning to hear others. Later that evening, Ethan and Nathaniel walked through the city of Westbridge. The lights reflected across the streets, and the city felt more open than before. Do you think everything will change now? Ethan asked. Nathaniel smiled slightly. Not immediately. Real change takes time. Ethan nodded. But it has started. Nathaniel looked at him. Yes, because someone finally spoke. Ethan smiled at those words. He remembered the day when he entered the selection hall believing he would always be invisible. Now he understood that his voice had never been the thing missing from his life. The confidence to use it was what he had been searching for. As they continued walking, Ethan realized something important. Nathaniel was the first person who truly listened to him, but he would not be the last. The world was beginning to listen too, and Ethan was ready for whatever came next. The selection center of Westbridge looked completely different from the day Ethan Carter first walked through its doors. The same grand hall remained, with its elegant architecture and familiar walls, but the feeling inside had changed. Years of tradition had been questioned, old assumptions had been challenged, and a new understanding had begun to grow. Ethan stood near the entrance and remembered the person he used to be. The Omega who lowered his voice before anyone asked him to. The person who believed being unnoticed was simply his place in the world. The person who thought his dreams were less important because nobody had taken the time to hear them. Now, he looked at the same room with different eyes. He no longer saw a place where decisions were made about him. He saw a place where people could finally be understood. The new selection process was officially introduced that morning. The council explained that future evaluations would focus on individual character, personal choices, and genuine compatibility instead of outdated expectations. Every person would have the opportunity to speak, to share their goals, and to be recognized as more than a family name or social position. Ethan listened carefully as the announcement was made. He knew the changes would not erase the past. They would not immediately heal every person who had felt ignored. But he also knew that a better future had to begin somewhere. After the ceremony, Ethan walked through the gardens outside the selection center with Nathaniel Brooks. The peaceful path reminded him of the first conversation they shared after the unexpected choice that changed everything. "Do you ever think about how different everything would be if you had not noticed me that day?" Ethan asked. Nathaniel looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "I think about how different everything would be if you had believed in yourself sooner." Ethan smiled. "Maybe I needed someone to remind me." Nathaniel nodded. "Everyone needs that sometimes." Ethan looked across the city of Westbridge. The streets were filled with people who were beginning to understand that every person carried a story they could not see from the outside. "I used to think being chosen was the most important thing that could happen to me," Ethan said. "But now I understand something else." Nathaniel looked at him. "What is that?" Ethan smiled softly. "The most important thing was learning that I was worth choosing in the first place." Those words represented the journey he had taken. Nathaniel had been the first person to truly listen to him, but Ethan had become the person who finally listened to himself. Later that day, Ethan visited his family home. The atmosphere was different from before. His relatives no longer spoke about him as someone who needed guidance. They asked his opinion. They listened to his thoughts. Even his relationship with his family had changed because Ethan no longer entered every conversation expecting to disappear. Lucas Carter joined him in the garden, and the two brothers watched the sunset together. "You seem different," Lucas said. Ethan smiled. "I think I finally became the person I was always supposed to be." Lucas nodded. "I am glad people finally see you." Ethan looked toward the sky. "I am glad I finally see myself." As time passed, Ethan and Nathaniel became a reminder throughout Westbridge that people should never be defined by the expectations placed on them. The quiet Omega who once believed his voice did not matter became someone who inspired others to speak. The powerful Alpha who first listened to him became the person who walked beside him as an equal. Their story was not remembered because one person was chosen over everyone else. It was remembered because someone who had spent years being silent finally discovered that his voice had always deserved to be heard.